All right, everybody. Hello. We are on Black Kids in Outer Space. And today I have Kazembe Balagun. He is a native Harlemite, writer, theorist, and activist deeply influenced by the freedom dreams of his ancestors. His writings have appeared in The Independent, and he has lectured in Black Archives in Amsterdam and the Brooklyn Academy of Music, among other places. He is a member of the New Day Church, a production fellow with Third World Newsreel, and organizes the urban programming for the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung New York office. So thank you so much for being here.
Hey, good morning, Log. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. No problem. So I think the first question I always ask everyone is, what is your first memory of space?
Well, my first memory of space is Harlem. Harlem for me was like I grew up in Harlem in the early 1980s, and at that
Mm-hmm.
time it was still a self-contained black community in a southern black community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So like so my ideas around space were like contained within that kind of like 10 block radius of like my the housing project that I grew up in. I grew up in the Polo Grounds, which is like on 155th Street and 8th Avenue. It's at the end of the
Mm-hmm.
river. So like our backs are against the water, and we're surrounded by the mountains. And then
Mm-hmm.
from that specific space that we I grew up in, I felt a sense of like how I became self conscious of my own blackness. You know, I'm surrounded by black
Mm-hmm.
people, surrounded by black families. And at that point in my life, I think that I really started developing an idea that, like neighborhoods, space, where you grew up in are integral in terms of how you reproduce yourself, how you learn yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just a simple factor of like your parents or who your parents are in your housing stuff, but also your block.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that too is also the spaces that, and as I grew older, I think that a lot of times I became more trans space. So like, so
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of like, as a kid growing up in 1980s, you kind of sneaking out to the village, you're hanging
Mm-hmm.
out downtown, you're buying the Village Voice, you're like seeing the different, areas that are going on, and then you're learning about other neighborhoods, and then you begin to negotiate how space kind of space and time also
Mm-hmm.
kind of cuts through. So the city becomes much larger. Your sense of time, and your time sense of shifting also shifts as well. And so, like for me, like that was kind of so like I feel like having an opportunity to grow up in Harlem, grow up in New
Mm-hmm.
York City, gave me that kind of sense of like what space was and how important it is in terms of what we talk about in terms of social reproduction of ideas and personalities.
Well, I think that's the thing is so interesting about the New York area, just how you space and how you guys have so little of it and how efficient that you make your space. So I kind of want to just jump into it. What is the Black Central City Commune? Is it an idea? Is it a place? What is it?
Well, I mean, it's both. I mean, unless like kind of if we can jump into it, I mean, like the idea of the commune obviously is like, it goes back to the Paris Commune of the 1870s.
Mm-hmm.
Which Karl Marx and Frederick Engels writes about as being the first example of a successful worker rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
For about 90 days, the workers of Paris took over the city. And in
Mm-hmm.
large part, it was a massive protest against um, corporate inequality. Um, you know,
Mm-hmm.
um, the city coffers were being looted um, to build these grand projects and workers lived in slums.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened with the commune is that basically the workers took over, and as Marx kind of puts out, that they had both executive and legislative power. So for the first time ever, for example, they developed they got rid of the standing army and the standing police and formed a communal police force.
Mm-hmm.
They called for wage equality for all employees, including city employees.
Mm-hmm.
The amazing thing is they ended night baking. Like you say, well, why did they end baking bread at night? Isn't that pleasurable? But no, the reason they did that is because they wanted workers who worked at night to have an opportunity to take night classes, to have
Mm-hmm.
education opportunities. And so from that point on, the commune that became this kind of like centralized idea that kind of like informs all revolutions in the 20th century. So when Lenin returns to Russia in 1917, the first thing he says is that we're no longer social democrats, we're communists. Saying we're going back to the commune. Lenin wrote frequently around the commune. And then you go to the 20th century, the commune is kind of popularized in the 1960s in America, but it's also popularized in the concept of a very countercultural way. So when we think about communes in American context, we either think about them as like very hippie, like, self-sufficient places of mostly white people in Vermont or California, or we think about them as cults. You know what I'm saying? But then when you think about it, when you think about groups like the Black Panther Party, for self-defense, like how were they able to do so much political work without like corporate funding or without without grants? Well, the way they did it was that they lived in communes. Black men and black women lived in communities together in the collective houses. They shared chores. And it became this kind of projection of the city that was actually kind of like really kind of liberating. And then you take that concept even broader it out. The thing about it is like if you think about like something like historians like Donna Murch or Chuck Morse out of California talk about, is that they talk about like the fact that the Black Panther Party, all their action in Oakland happened within a 10-block radius within Oakland. So picture it. So we talk about the Black Panther Party. We know they're out of Oakland, but they're a very specific place in Oakland. Since we talk about geography, they're in West Oakland. They're surrounded. They're in front of them. In front of West Oakland is the pier. In the back in the back of them, they're cordoned off. They're redlined and ghettoized into these very small kind of enclaves. So about 1 million people, close to like 100, not 1 million people, close to 100,000 of Black people are within these like 10 to 15 block radius. So when you think about the Black Panther Party and the idea of self-defense and the ideas of like internal colonies, and also the ideas around the Black commune, you're talking about this is a very real reality for Black folks in terms of geographical space, right? In terms of actual spatiality. And so when we're talking about ideas around communalism or communism, that these ideas are really rooted in the fact that Black folks are ghettoized, the ghettoized, the self-conscious. By the 1960s, they're becoming politically empowered, and so there's this gaze in which that oftentimes we kind of focus on in terms of like degradation, actually becomes a term of empowerment. So by the 1960s, we all know the songs, Isaac Hayes, Soulville, Lou Rawls, across 110th Street. This idea of the Black commune, the idea of the ghetto as a place of self-containment becomes very important. So then it becomes an idea, but then it becomes a political concept, right? As the 60s kind of roll around, how do we start talking about self-government? How do we start talking about housing? How do we start talking about, job creation? We have to start talking about political empowerment and self-determination. And pretty much, it gets more and more forward-thinking by the 1960s, specifically as the civil rights movement moves from the southern communities into the northern communities.
I just think that's amazing, and I love the fact that I've interviewed both Donna and Chuck various times on different shows. But another thing, because I want to make sure we get to everything, and you actually hit me to this wonderful little piece of history, Commune in Focus by Harry Quintana and Charles Jones. Well, it was about and they kind of wrote this article that was in what was it in? It was in the first published in Perspective, the journal of the Yale School of Architecture. And I'm going to pull a quote from it. It said that in regards to urban planning in our communities, it was not designed for us, and we are not in control of it. And apparently, this was this at the something about Stokey Carmichael. Kwame Ture, He served as a judge on the Howard University Architecture and Design contest in 1968. Well, this was actually kind of a different thing, but can you go a little bit into that? Because I'm just so excited. I love that story.
Yeah, exactly. This was really briefly. So by 1968, by 67, 65, there's massive rebellions happening in Harlem, and in Watts, and in Detroit. By 68, the United States is involved in the war in Vietnam. The Black freedom struggle is moving from the southern areas into the cities, and the northern cities is becoming much more younger, much more militant. And as that's going on, the United States government is also focusing their energies on this idea around urban renewal, right? And
Mm-hmm.
which in a lot of ways, it marked, which people like Max Bond called like Negro removal. It was like
Mm-hmm.
it was tremendously detrimental into the cities. A lot of ways, like black people were being redlined out of their neighborhoods into housing projects, not being given the same opportunity to move into suburbs or have housing equity similar to their white counterparts and things of that nature. So in a lot of ways, in 1969, a lot of the thinking and the theorizing, around black activism was actually going into the cities, and
Mm-hmm.
and activists were actually very much involved in like kind of like coming up with different types of languages. So Max Bond, who I mentioned, was a member of a group called the Architects Against the Vietnam War, and he makes a
Mm-hmm.
comparison between the need to end the war in Vietnam and also the need to build up like self determination amongst black people in housing in the cities. And
Mm-hmm.
two of his students, Harry Quintana and Charles Jones, write this
Mm-hmm.
article. First, it's saying that as you noted in that really beautiful quote, that the first thing we have to realize that most of the urban planners who are making these decisions are mostly technocratic and white, and removes them from the community. Even though, ironically, if you think about someone like Whitney Young, who points out in his very scathing speech to architects in 1968 of the same year, he says that look, like all of you architects, you have campuses in black communities, and yet and still like you can't even think through like creative ways of dealing with like space and time and dealing with inequality. So for Quintana and Jones, it's really incumbent for urban architects to really kind of go to the community and really create basis of the community. And one of the ways they did so in a very dramatic way was inviting Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael, many people may not realize it because he's not a name that's as familiar as like Huey Newton or some other folks,
Mm-hmm.
but like he was an architect of the term Black Power. He wrote a
Mm-hmm.
book with Charles Jones called Black Power, in which in that book they call for new forms of government, in black communities, and it's called for voter registration, call for black self determination in the urban settings, and build up black political power to determine your own destinies in the cities, and that could be a new kind of blueprint. So, and also the fact of the matter is that Stokely Carmichael at this time is a rock star.
Mm-hmm.
He was on Meet the Press. Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president at the time, was asked the FBI director J. Edgar Hoover for daily reports on Stokely Carmichael's whereabouts. He's like,
Mm-hmm.
he's feted by, the liberal establishment press, the whole issue of the New York Review of Books on Black Power. So asked to have Stokely Carmichael in the article. I think you're gonna upload it later. It shows Stokely
Mm-hmm.
Carmichael there with a bunch of like black people in Howard. Stokely's wearing dashiki. All the other Howard people are wearing like bow ties and suits, and Stokely's like, as a juror, and actually doing the jury work in the work. And the last thing I'll say about this is that I think that this is a very much an indication of also what was going on in '68 too, because what you have also in 1968 is also like challenges on the in the university campuses.
Mm-hmm.
At Columbia University, Columbia tries to expand out into Morningside Park and try to take over Harlem, and there's a coalition between white students from the Students for Democratic Society and Harlem residents to stop Columbia's expansion to Harlem. You have the opening of Black Studies at the City University of New York and open admission. So there's a demand of university students and also knowledge production, and that's another important
Mm-hmm.
space to be accountable to the community. And I think that that's one of the beautiful things about seeing Stokely there as a juror on the architectural contest. And Stokely in the article is like, look, I'm not an architect. I don't know anything about planning. I don't know anything about urban planning. But
Mm-hmm.
they, but Quintana and Jones are like, look, you're a black resident of D.C. You know more about like critical space and geography than anybody in this school. And based on that,
Mm-hmm.
Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture makes a decision to participate, and it's a beautiful thing.
I just think that it's just so amazing how it's kind of interconnected. I mean, I think about like Whitney Young, the National Urban League, and how he addressed the need for diversity. But I think the thing that surprised me more was, even though I know about this, but to be reminded of, J. Max Bond, a black architect, calling urban renewal meant Negro removal. And I'm kind of like wondering, who are those real radical urban planners now? Who are they? Do we have any?
I think the thing about it is that I think we're growing towards it. I think that
Yeah.
I think this is going to be. I think part of the reason that I kind of put this out, and like for one reason is that this work belongs in the movement.
Yes.
It is
Yes.
saying, saying I think it's great that if academics get a hand of it and they use it in the classes or whatever. But I think articles like this belong to the movement, and I think that it's high time that we do some movement thinking around this. I mean, and I think that when we're thinking about today, I mean, there's some really radical projects that are happening in the United States. I mean, for one instance, like you have the Evergreen Cooperative in Cleveland, Ohio, which is
Mm-hmm.
doing like really dope work in terms of like this basically getting a city contract for laundry work. Say and employing
Mm-hmm.
people for union wages in a cooperative. You have groups like Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, who are now building like a community production unit where they're actually going to be doing 3D printing of like actual
Mm-hmm.
houses on community land. So I think that it's an interesting conversation to have right now because obviously in New York City, both of us are in the tri-state area. There's
Mm-hmm.
a humongous conversation around Amazon HQ2, right? And the fact of the
Mm-hmm.
matter is that these like HQ2 is going to be in Long Island City, about 7 blocks from the Queensbridge houses, which is like the largest public housing in the country. And so like so this idea around who controls technology, who has access to space, who has access to
Mm-hmm.
land is going to be very important right now in terms of our movement forward because once HQ2 comes through, I mean there's a lot of concern around like gentrification, increased surveillance, responsibilities in terms of the environment. So I think that
Mm-hmm.
activists, today, and particularly housing activists today, should be looking towards these work from the past to inform our struggles for today.
Yes, and another thing I want to bring up is the article. Are you there?
I'm sorry, that was kind of good. Like, oh,
That's okay. I understand.
yeah,
There you go. Stay right there because that's a perfect
okay,
spot for you. All right.
thank you.
So, the Commune by Lorenzo Camboa Irving. The Commune is talked about the control of the Black community by the Black Autonomy Federation. Because anarchists or Black anarchists believe the first step of determination and self-determination is Black control of the Black community. I felt that was like a really kind of an interesting article. And what are your thoughts about that? Like, anarchism and socialism, and in regards to connecting urban planning.
Well, I think the thing that's really beautiful about that is there's a couple of things. I think one is that this concept of commune will continue to come up in various ways, and I think that and I think some of the protest movements we've seen in terms of this public like amassing, for example, like Occupy, the movement of squares in Greece, the 15M movement in Spain. I mean, these are all urban
Mm-hmm.
movements, right? And
Mm-hmm.
these are all types of communing that's happening. People were eating
Mm-hmm.
together, sleeping together, sharing Wi-Fi together. All these things are happening, and like and this one of the things I really want to talk about in terms of commune is that commune is different from cooperative
Mm-hmm.
because commune requires a level of intimacy, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so like I think that the boundary crossing nature of a commune is something that's really kind of interesting that we should also talk about it in regards to that as a direct challenge to a lot of technocracy that we see in urban planning. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's very important too. In terms of like the idea around like the kind of like the black control of the cities and the things of that nature. I mean, I think that we're in a very interesting point right now with this, like, massive amounts of gentrification. Private real estate companies are running the conversation around housing. So I mean, I think that,
Yes.
you know what I'm saying. So I think that in a lot of ways, these ideas are really important in terms of the deep nature of the need to democratize the cities. So I mean, so I'm really kind of impressed by what's happening in, say, Barcelona right now with the municipalism movement, where, like, folks
Mhm.
like Ada Colau are actually really trying to, like, bring the city hall into the local arena and making decisions around housing are made by the people themselves.
Mhm.
I'm really impressed by, and I really want to see more what's going to happen with these some of these mayoral places like Jackson, where you have, like, radical mayors who are trying to do some of this
Mhm.
work as well. So I think that these are really kind of key ideas. But also I think that we also in this sense too that um, cities are places of challenging of inequality. Cities are places of, I mean, 70% of the world's GDP comes out of cities. So
Mhm.
so 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 both so cities are these kind of like paradoxes, where traditionally, if you were a feudal serf, you would run to the city and be free. If you were
Mhm.
a slave African, you would run to the city and be free. But at the same time, there's also, like, you have to deal with the fact that, Wall Street, the first commodities sold on Wall Street were African slaves. So how
Damn,
do you
that's just
yeah, so like,
that's
so like,
horrible.
yeah, so like those, yeah, so like the contradictions within the city life, is real. But I think that these
Mhm.
ideas around communalization, um, you know, offer a way to think about them and to actually theorize, but also act upon ways to actually build a new type of city. And I think that that's
Mhm.
one of the ways we have to kind of look at. What does a city look like in 21st century? One that has, you know, housing for all, healthcare for all, but also democratic control for all.
hmm And just kind of like to wrap it up. I mean, you're so interesting. I have to like have you on here again and talk about something else. But the literary art, because I know that you write about music and you're very into writing and literary and art. And how does that inform the Black space, Black geography, yourself, like modern day?
Yeah, I mean, like, to me, I mean, look, there's a couple of things. I mean, well, maybe this is a separate show, but I mean, there really has to be talk about, like, the Black arts movement and Black literary figures in terms of as being urban planners.
hmm
So when you think about, like, James Baldwin's essay "Notes of a Native Son," that's written, in the midst of the 1943 Harlem Rebellion. Then you think about someone like June Jordan, who writes Sky Rise over Harlem, and she's collaborating with Buckmaster Fuller to do a remapping and a reimagining of Harlem. She imagines, like, huge towers in Harlem that are built along old storefronts. And then
hmm
certainly that, in the concrete terms, also you have someone like a Mary Baraka, Leroy Jones, who's like actually lived in every neighborhood he went to, became like a rebellious neighborhood. So he lived in East Village. The social construction of the East Village, very much, he's a popularizer of that. You talk about jazz. I mean, he's one of the first people to, like bring jazz into the East Village and become an integrated sensibility of, like, in terms of Archie Shepp, Pharoah Sanders, John Coltrane. But then he goes to Harlem and, like, leads the Black Arts movement and does the same thing. And then he goes to Newark, and in Newark he actually has a plan for the Catalina houses, which was going to be like a Black nationalist housing project that actually had state funding, was about to be built, and then it was kind of rejected by white, like, kind of racist white folks. So,
Not
like,
shocking.
not shocking at all. But I think that the thing about the cities, that what attracts us to the cities and what's really good is that, we're living in a time of tremendous right wing backlash. Cities
hmm
that I think people realize that cities are important in terms of our vision, which is like, I think that, against, like, the kind of, like, hard right ethno nationalism or of white nationalism, like, cities
hmm
offer us an opportunity to think about, a pluralistic, democratic sensibility. But again, within those contradictions, we're also dealing with that with ideas around capital, right, and challenging
hmm
capital. So there's always a possibility. So I think that part of the life of the city is both that kind of, like, thinking about broad terms of, like, internationalism, thinking about broad terms of like cultures that are like kind of rising up and meeting each other and using that as impetus for a new type of broader counterculture that can also give us a blueprint for a different type of society and more and more freedom dreams.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for amazing interview that not only gave us like a little look at the past, but also a look at the present and a look at what could be the future. So thanks, and I'm sure we will see you. And thank everybody for watching. You have a great rest of the day.
Hey, you have a great day
Bye.
too. Thanks so much. Bye bye.
Okay, bye bye.